Can everybody hear me? Here's the most important part. We've got an hour drive to the restaurant, so listen fast. All right. I want to back up and try to tie together some of last night, and I was trying to give a reason for why I gave that whirlwind chaotic presentation. In North Carolina, in the early part of the colony, did not have liberty for religion. They just didn't have the people enforcing the laws, if you will. And so, because there was such oppression, there were Baptists who had come to Virginia, and in Virginia, they were whipping them and branding them. And so they ventured down into North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state, in what they call the Albemarle area, the Albemarle Sound. And so there were churches there. We don't have good records. And if you go back and you look at the history of the Baptists, you'd understand that anytime the persecution happened, they destroyed their materials. It's hard to, the records we have of the Donatists or the Waldensians are mostly by their enemies. And so you read what the Catholics wrote about them and learn who they really were and what they believed, because they destroyed all that they could that they found of their writings. The Waldensians would copy the Bibles by hand. They didn't have printing presses. They were up in the Alps, and they would have their school of the barber, and they would meet, and they would write them out by hand. And they had places they would hide the Bibles when the Catholic Crusades came through to try to wipe them out. And at one time, they even baked the Bible in a loaf of bread to preserve it. And so that's that nature of persecution we don't grasp, we don't understand. We've never seen that. And so that same mentality came to the New World, to here. And as the colony began to grow, there began to be persecution here within the state. It was not as strong as Virginia or some of the northern colonies, but it did begin here. And it brings us down to a time that there was several different ones. And I mentioned George Whitefield last night and his preaching, and God used him to preach the gospel. But he did not have the authority to set churches, because Anglican Church by the Bible is no church at all. It comes from the Catholic Church, which is no church at all. And, well, I'm going to run a rabbit trail for a moment. But if you'll find a book, you can find it free online. It's called The Trilema, or Death by Three Horns. And it's the record of the Presbyterians meeting in America. And they said, and you got to go back and understand, the Protestants began to read the Bible. And they said that the Pope in the Revelation, they recognized what he was doing, that whore, the Catholic Church. That's who it is. And so they recognized that. And so even the Protestants called them that. And so the Presbyterians had a big national meeting in the 1800s, and I'm paraphrasing this very loosely. You can go read the book. And in that meeting, they said the Catholic priests are no priests. They don't have authority to be a priest. And the young guys wanted to pass this resolution declaring that they were not a church and they were not. And the older guys said, wait a minute, guys. If we declare them non-church, we by default declare ourselves non-church, because we get our authority from them. And they tabled it. It happened twice in the Presbyterians, and they never dealt with it, because the truth of the matter is, when you look at it, either you got to say the Catholic Church is the Church of God, or the Presbyterians ain't no church, and the Methodists ain't no church, and the Lutherans ain't no church, and on, take your pick. So, anyway, there's my rabbit trail. Let's come back. So George Whitefield could preach the gospel, but he did not start. Neither would the Anglicans cooperate, because they didn't like what he was doing. But God used him mightily. You see, everybody that God uses has not got everything right. Anybody here got everything right? Don't answer that question. All right, so let's keep going. And so Brother Smith was about to say yes. But anyway, all right, I'm sorry. Y'all bear with me. I'm human. Somebody was talking this week about jesting. I thought, man, they've been looking at me. But he would preach, and I appreciate what Brother John Cameron mentioned him last night, what he brought out in his study of George Whitefield. One fella testifies that he thought it was thunder. And he went up to see what was going on, and there was the horses running by to go hear George Whitefield preach. They thought it was thunder. That's how loud it was. Mm-hmm. And so this man had a voice, not like mine, they would hear him over yonder. And he would preach the truth of the gospel and how to be saved. These people, they get saved. Friend, if you think you're saved and you don't have a desire for the Word of God, there's something wrong. Mm-hmm. There's something wrong. All right? That just comes with being a child of God. You want to read His book. And so they begin to read the book. And we talked about Shubal Stearns last night. Well, Shubal Stearns, of course, he gets ordained by Wade Palmer. He comes down to North Carolina. We talked about Jersey Church on the way here and how John Gano came down. John Gano was associated with the Philadelphia Association. And so they came both down here at the same time frame. They were in two different camps, if you will. That's a term we use today, you know. They were in two different camps. But John Gano and Shubal Stearns became friends. And actually, Shubal Stearns got John Gano to come to one of the camp meetings. But the Sandy Creek preachers were cold shoulder to him. They were kind of standoffish. And after a morning, a session or so of that, he headed out. And when he left, Shubal Stearns got up, to use my terms, chewed him out. And said somebody asked him to come back. And so when they came back, they asked him to preach. When he began to preach, they began to go, he can preach. He can preach. Actually, we're saying that. And some of them, after listening to him, and by the way, many of these preachers were illiterate. They only knew what somebody would read the Bible to them. They would memorize it. And they listened to John Gano, an educated man. And some of them said, I felt like I could never preach again after hearing that. So Shubal Stearns and John Gano were friends. Now, when we passed the area where I talked about Jersey Church, and you, the Hardys, y'all were in the car. You remember coming through Denton, little town of Denton, about 10 miles north of Denton. I talked to them, and I forgot to call you. About 10 to 15 miles to the left of us, the east, Jersey Church is over there. 25, 30 miles to the right, Sandy Creek. All right, so that's how far apart they were, if you can kind of keep in your mind. They were that far apart. And so Jersey Church is growing. Sandy Creek is growing. Churches are being planted. The first church planted out of Sandy Creek is Abbott's Creek up here by High Point, North Carolina. And Daniel Marshall was the first pastor at Abbott's Creek, and he was Shubal Stearns' brother-in-law. Shubal Stearns wanted to ordain him. He wanted somebody else to lay hands besides him. And he was the only ordained man at Sandy Creek at the time. And they got a fella, and his name left mine as I was trying to think of it, but he was the pastor of Welsh Neck Baptist Church in what today is Society Hill, South Carolina. It still exists today. They got an old baptistry there you can go see. I've been there and seen it. One day we'll make that one of our tours. But he got him to come and help him ordain Daniel Marshall. And Daniel Marshall became the first pastor of Abbott's Creek. Daniel Marshall would go on and start other churches, go down into South Carolina and start churches. By the way, these fellows were preaching all over the place. Now you think about how we drove today. They were riding horseback into Virginia to preach. I mean, Daniel Marshall impacted the life of Samuel Harris. I'm trying to remember now. I believe Samuel Harris might have been the first one Daniel Marshall baptized. But I'm not sure. But some of you remember he was known as Colonel Harris. He was the apostle of Virginia, he was called. A tremendous man of God, preaching all over the place. And on the list goes. And this thing is just expanded. Now, back up. You see, we came out of the Dark Ages in a sense as a world, but we didn't come out of the mentality of Catholicism as a world. Government and religion were still united. Remember that picture at Lynn? They had the stocks in the churchyard. They're still united. And so they were still using the church to control people. Can I run a quick rabbit? Evolution is a religion, is an attempt to control people. And so they were still trying to do that. So as these guys began to understand the truth, it posed a problem to the colonial governments. And Brother Beller, I remember him saying that. Government is a necessary beast that must be chained. A necessary beast that must be chained. Because if it's not chained, it's out of control. That's where we're headed in America. It's pretty well out of control. And so that was in their day, the colonial government. They were wicked. Boy, oh boy. I'm going to save this. Y'all remind me, and we can make a phone call to the Hardy's van. And on the bus, I want to tell you about the guy I talked to on the phone from Abbott's Creek, because I'm going to get too long if I go into that right now. But it was just awesome talking to him. So, where we at? So, they began to pose a problem to the colonial government, because when you begin to live for God, you know, one of the things that happens, is there anybody here that never told a lie? Thank you for your honesty. But what happens when God saves you? You begin to become honest. Another thing that happens is you begin to get upset with dishonest people.
Yes, you do.
Well, that's what's going on. Governor Trine's taxing them to build a palace for his wife to live in. And they're out here cutting down trees to build a shack to live in and trying to jump out stumps so they can plant some corn and feed their family through the winter, and he's wanting more money from them. I'm paraphrasing. There's so many things that feed into that. There were different legal acts, etc., that were passed and were harassing them. They began to meet together to protest. And that group that met together was called the Regulators. You say, what does that mean? They wanted to regulate the government. They wanted to chain the beast. Can I take another quick rabbit trail? The Second Amendment talks about a well-regulated militia. Wonder where they got that word. They tied same root word, right? So let's move on. So they began to meet. They sent letters to the governor. They elected men to go to what we would call the state Congress today, or the state legislative bodies. Some of them were even arrested after they went and voted and stated things. And, they got fed up. There was a guy by the name of Colonel Fanning. He was a wicked man. He was Governor Trine's right-hand man. And they caught him one time in the courthouse and beat him up. Governor Trine didn't like that too much. They beat up the courthouse, Guilford Courthouse, tore it up. And I'm not advocating that, but I just have to tell you, from a human standpoint, every time I see a picture of that, I get happy. But moving on. I don't even want to talk about the things that Fanning did. So Governor Tryon begins to enlist troops to come suppress these backwoods farmers. Now, the Anglicans weren't strong in the North Carolina colony. He made a deal with the Presbyterians that you could be considered a legitimate church if you joined. And they did. I think that this is me. I don't have any historical documentation that says this. This is me pulling things together from things I looked at. Well, a few years ago, I began to go, you know what, Sandy Creek started with 16 people. In just a few years, they got over 600 in the backwoods of North Carolina. I had the stuff here. within like 17 years, there was 125 churches and 45 preachers. One day I said, where'd these people come from that got saved? Who were they? A large part of them were Presbyterians. A lot of Presbyterians moved into the Carolinas. And so I believe the Presbyterians might have had an ulterior motive for joining up with Tribe. That's in some history right there. All right? That they said, yeah, we're going to get equal with these folks. They've been taking our people. And Presbyterians, they would go to church. And they would get in the spirit once they got it out of the bottle. That's how they got in the spirit. Drink it out of the bottle. And so when they got saved, it's a whole new world. And so anyway, so he gets his army together and he marches across. And he comes, and if you've been to the Battle of Alamos, I think about everybody has, and they come there and they meet the Regulators there. And I'm not going to go into detail. You can get some details on that. But there's a short battle, and the Regulators lose. Now, some of it is when you read history, you got to try to figure out some things are
left out.
not sure what's true. But it seems that very possibly Pugh, you see the name here, James Pugh. Or is it here? Yeah, Pugh.
Yeah, just Pugh.
All right. There's much debate right now among some historians. Was it really James Pugh? Because they found records of James Pugh living after the Regulators. Maybe it was another Pugh. But it's believed that he was a sharpshooter. Anybody ever loaded a musket? A muzzle loader? Loaded a muzzle loader? How fast can you load it?
Not very. If you're well trained, one round about every 2 minutes.
Back in the Revolutionary War, they could get off about a round a minute. But with Pugh, the story is he was behind rocks with 3 guys, and they were loading and handing him the rifle. And he was taking them out. He's a sharpshooter. So he had 3 guys loading, and he'd shoot one, they'd hand him another, they'd hand him another. And so they wanted him. They didn't like him. But what happened, of course, is that Governor Tryon, they win the battle. Short battle, a couple hours at the most. Well, that's not all he's going to do. He goes from there to Sandy Creek and destroys many of the Sandy Creek church members' homes. He goes from there to Jersey Church to Benjamin Merle's plantation. He takes over his house. He puts his headquarters in his house. He puts Benjamin Merle. I don't want to talk to you anymore. He puts Benjamin Merle in jail. Benjamin Merle was a wealthy man. They put him in jail on the 3rd story of his own home. He had a 3-story house. He had a plantation, and I'm trying to silence this thing, so I don't want to do it again. I'm waiting on it to get done here. He was also, he had a creek on his property, and he had a mill on that creek where you could grind corn and wheat and stuff. Well, he also had another thing, and he'd set that thing up at night with a piece of metal, and it would be running all night long, and in the morning he had a gun barrel. He was a gunsmith. Mm-hmm. He was a captain in the militia. He didn't make it to the Battle of Alamos. If he would have made it, it would have probably been a different battle. He had 300 men with him. He was a few hours away. It would probably been a total different history. We say, oh, I wish he would have. Well, he kind of needed God to do it the way God did it. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, so they arrest him. Now, remember, I was talking to you on the bus and said Jersey Church is 10, 15 miles through the woods in the opposite direction of what we were headed. And we drove another hour or so to get here by modern highways at 60 and 70 miles an hour. They arrested him at his home, drug him through the countryside. They went from Jersey Church to Abbott's Creek and decimated things there. They attacked all the Baptist settlements. and they drug them through the countryside as prisoners, all the way here. He ordered, well, he hung one man about 3 days after the battle to make an example to scare people. And then he had a trial, kangaroo court. They were already guilty before they went in. There were 12 men on trial. Now, in reading about Meser, he was a captain, I believe. In reading about him, we find that his wife and son, the families were ordered to come to the hanging. So they had to travel all that distance. If you could think about Miss Merle with several children coming through the countryside. Her husband has been hauled away in chains, and she's headed over. She's got days she's coming through to get here. Captain Meeser's son, I can't remember, 6 or 10 years old, came and begged Tryon to take him and let his daddy live for his family. To no mercy. Benjamin Merle, wife and children, the order was they were to be hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, their bowels burned before them, and their families were to watch. Some people debated whether or not it happened. In my understanding, I believe it happened. And I'll tell you why. Miss Merle was a member of Jersey Church, which was decimated as well. The record in Saints and Sinners, which is the history of Jersey Church, is that Miss Merle, after this, would walk and through the woods and wring her hands for hours on end, and she went blind for no medical reason other than grief. I will tell you that much as I know of the truth, Benjamin Merle, as I read it, some people, I've read historians who said that Benjamin Merle recanted before he was hanged. When I read his statements, I don't see it as recanting. You can read it and make your own judgment. But he did say, don't hold this, what I've done, to my family's charge. I'm paraphrasing. And if you would please let them have some of my estate. And Governor Tryon did that. He let the Merles keep the property. Miss Merle had the property. Now, let me go back and tell you another thing about the Merles. When Benjamin Merle was in jail on the 3rd story of his house, there was a young lady in the Wiseman family. They were founding members of the Jersey Church. And she was beautiful to look at. And she acquired the attention of the commanding officer. And she would come in and bring stuff to the Merles who were in jail. And he was fond of her. And so this commanding officer said, we're leaving tomorrow. Is there anything I can do for you? She said, release Benjamin Merle. He said, I can't do that. She said, then release his son. And he did. And they got married and were members of Jersey Church. There's Wiseman's buried in the Jersey Church graveyard behind the church. You find the tombstones. So God used this mightily because if you will go, you should go to the Battle of Alamance, and you go over there where the building is, and the flags in different positions are laid out across the highway. Over there, farther than that tree line, is something that looks like a miniature Washington monument. If you'll go over there to that monument, it's four-sided at the base, and you can read the plaques. Now, that monument was originally at Guilford Courthouse, and they moved it. Now, the first time I went to Battle of Alamance, there was a man there, and he was well-versed. He was a reenactor, and he was a state employee. He was in one of Brother McGuire's videos. And I came in arrogant. And I said, why do you say this is not the first battle of the Revolutionary War? And he very kindly looked at me and said, do you see the uniform I'm wearing? They told me to. North Carolina uniform. If he was wearing a federal uniform, if they call it the first battle of the Revolutionary War, it'd be a federal uniform. So, and he was very kind about it. Shut me up, put me in my place real fast. And so taught me a lot. But then one day I was there with Pastor Woody. He said, "What's that over there?" I said, "I've never walked over there." He said, "Let's go look." It had been pouring down rain. Water was standing out there about 2 inches deep. And we go sloshing through the water, and there's 4 plaques on this thing. The one on the back side says, First Battle of the Revolutionary War. They put it out there and turned it away. And that happened years ago as they attempt to rewrite history. All right? So, many people consider this, yes, that's it right there. Many people understand this is a predecessor. This is a lead into the Revolutionary War. This impacted other colonies, especially what Tryon did. Tryon left the state right after this, became governor of New York. In the Revolutionary War, he was able to get on a ship and escape, or they'd have had his hide. Yep. And so they hung these. James Pugh made a tremendous statement as he had the noose around his neck. And in part of his statement, he said that our blood would be the seed, and it just left me. Does anybody remember that statement? Our blood would follow fertile ground and would bring forth 100-fold or something like that. And as he was making the statement, Colonel Fanning had his aide kick the bucket out from under him, so he didn't finish the statement. And so, and that was a prophecy that was fulfilled. Now, after the Battle of Alamance, 1,500 families moved from the Piedmont of North Carolina, most across the mountains into what is today eastern Tennessee. They actually established their own nation of Franklin. It's called the Stillborn State. They had a constitution. After the Revolution, they joined North Carolina, and they were very upset at how North Carolina handled it afterwards, but nevertheless. That is where the Over Mountain Men started. These fellas moved after this, and they came back and fought at Kings Mountain, and they fought at some of the other battles too. But this little place here that most of North Carolina has never seen and knows nothing about is a place of great honor. Benjamin Murrow, I don't think I said this here, he was a deacon at Jersey Church. Let me say this about this. These people had a rough mind battle. What do I mean by that? Just before the Revolutionary War was the French and Indian War. George Washington got his military experience in the French and Indian War with the British. These older preachers in the Sandy Creek era, some of them had been on the frontier. Daniel Marshall had been out there in the frontier. The British were their friends. These were tough decisions. These were tough decisions. And this split people in this colony for years, it divided. You start understanding that, and I begin to understand more, because some people will criticize maybe the Sandy Creek crowd, the Sandy Creek Association, because they condemned the Regulators. But that's the mentality. They've just come out of the French and Indian War. And those British are their friends, helping save them from the Indians. And now you want to go fight them. This is a tough decision. Tough decision. I wouldn't want to have to make those decisions. But some men did, and we reap the fruit of it today. And so we want to honor these memories. We want to know these memories. And we need to understand our history. It's important that we do. Anybody have a question or comment?